If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, campers and park rangers. What is the creepiest thing you have found while in the woods? In Georgia, I unknowingly walked into abandoned cemetery for children. It was overgrown with weeds and bushes, and I nearly tripped over some tiny headstones from the 1800s. There are no signs or anything anywhere, just a lot of graves that you can't quite make out until you are walking on top of them. When I was a teenager, my dad took my brother and I on a week-long canoeing, hiking and camping trip to a series of lakes that were only accessible by trail or float plane. We launched at 5 a.m. and paddled for 4 hours until reaching the trailhead. Then we packed our bags into the first lake, dropped them there and returned for our canoe. It was probably noon by the time we started paddling across, and it took a couple more hours to make it to the other end where the trailhead to the second lake was. By now we were tired and sore. There wasn't any good spot for a campsite at the second trailhead, so, while weary, we decided to press on to the second lake and find a spot there. We were running low on water, but weren't worried about it as there was an old sign at the trailhead that said there was a spring a few kilometers up the trail. As we hiked on, we would periodically see signs posted to trees, advertising the ever-decreasing distance to the sought-after and pleasantly named Silver Spring. About an hour after we had left the lake, we found a sign with an arrow pointing off into the bushes directing us towards the water source. We left our packs and carried our canteens off into the forest. A few short minutes later, we saw a final sign with an arrow pointing to a spot just behind an outcropping of rocks. We eagerly rounded the outcropping and stood there stunned, dry mouths agape at the sight of a ducking giant silver-painted metal spring with a sign above declaring Silver Spring with an arrow pointing down at it. Keep in mind that this was literally in the middle of nowhere, a full and hard day's travel. Whoever lugged that son of a bitching thing in there? And made signs and arrows to match. My hat goes off to you, friend. I hope you had a good laugh. You jerk. Backpacking in the Beartooth Wilderness in early 2000s with a good friend of mine. 3 days into the hike, we had only seen one other couple. On the third night, at about 4 a.m. we were awoken in our tent to what sounded like screams in the forest, big guttural screams. Obviously we were freaked out sitting in the tent not knowing what was out there. We started hearing what sounded like hail, for about 15 minutes, followed by heavy footsteps near our camp. My friend and I started yelling and making tons of noise, a trick to fend off bears, and the commotion outside the tent slowly came to a halt. In the morning, after not sleeping at all, we unzipped the tent to the creepiest scene. All around the tent were pebbles, the hail, literally thousands of little pebbles that were not there the evening before. Surrounding the tent in a near perfect circle were 20 or so 150 to 300 pounds boulders. My friend and I noped out of there, making a 3-day hike into a one. Practically running the entire way to the car. Was on a 2-week canoe camping trip in a really remote part of Canada. Most days we would only see 1 or 2 other people. Some days we didn't see anyone. Set up camp on the shore of a big lake and started settling in, when suddenly we heard someone yelling, "Bear, bear." It sounded like a girl's voice. It was bear country, so we all grabbed buckets and started making noise to scare it away. Then suddenly out of the woods comes this young kid. He couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Turns out he was actually yelling, "Help, I'm scared." There was no bear. He had been riding his bike and somehow wound up in the woods on the other side of the lake, at least a mile from his parents. He was totally lost and was starting to lose it. We took him via canoe back to his parents, who were relieved to say the least. Years later, it's still hard to believe that this happened. I am neither of the things in the title. However, I was in a Firewise program with the county. We'd clear roughly 200 square feet around somebody's house. Anyway, we were clearing brush around an elderly man's home, and he suggested over and over that this one area was of no threat and to just skip it. Well, we can't just skip it, that'd leave a weak spot, so we had no choice. After getting almost all of it clear, there was a bit of ladder fuel in one area. We used a bladed weed eater to do this kind of thing. After getting almost the entire 10 to 15 square feet patch cleared, I could not knock down this one patch to ground level. Dented my blades and I was confused. Realized it was hitting a metal bar. So I dug around and realized it was a refrigerator buried so deep only the door handles tuck out after I knocked off the dirt. After finding this, I alerted my co-worker/friend, BTW. We never found anything like this. Usually it's just trees/bushes/shrubs etc. So he comes up, and we play the no you open it game. After about 5 minutes, curiosity gets the best of me and I open it. But it's jammed. So I start reaming on it and he helps me, and it kind of screeches a little bit. It smelled like nothing I've ever encountered. The most horrid stench. We back up like 30 feet and it doesn't help. So I walk up and open it all the way. The smell made my eyes water and regret having a nose. My mouth was open a little bit and I could taste that foul stench. I figured WTF, the worst already happened. I peek inside and it's a random assortment of bones. I can't tell if animal because there are no horns/skulls, just random fragments/ribs/long bones like the ones in an animal's leg, I could only assume. So we mention this to our boss and he says he'll add it in his report. A couple weeks later it becomes the word, area of interest I guess. Apparently another service had to investigate it, however since this was the very last of the entire area to be cleared once we left that day, of finding it, nobody went back until that service crew arrived a month later only to find a large hole where the fridge was. The homeowner denies there ever being anything there at all. Just a hole in his land. I still don't know what I stumbled upon. Doing a group trip in the woods. Literally 40 minutes from any town. We ask our group leader if we can go back to our cabin as night rolls around. He says sure and we begin to walk. We have to walk through a path that's 10 minutes long and in the middle of a thick forest. When we are halfway to our cabin, I get an uneasy feeling. I turn around and literally 10 feet behind us is this random guy in a yellow poncho following us. I tell my friends, we all turn around, none of us recognize him. The guy in the poncho just smiles at us for a second and then runs off the path into the woods. So, my friends and I sprint to the cabin and enter, the rest of the group is already there. We tell the group leader there about it, he calls the other leaders and they start looking around. They don't find anything, but a new rule was put in place that required someone to be with a leader at all times when you are outside of your cabin. Backpacking on Shasta, we hit our camping spot late so we only had time to set up, eat and go to bed. In the morning we can finally look around, and right by our tent, in the rock outcropping, a very nice box is wedged in containing someone's remains. Also on that trip, after about 7 hours of hiking up Shasta, we see a man walking down, in a suit, dress shoes, and carrying a briefcase. Shasta can be a weird and mysterious place. Once I was on a high school trip in the Netherlands, and after we did some activities during the day, we ended the day by playing a game of Live Stratego in the woods next to the farm where we slept. For the people that don't know what Live Stratego is, it's a live version of a board game, where soldiers attack each other without knowing what rank, which determines who'll win, the other has, and by memory try to remember who's got which rank. In the live variation you had to tag and ask people what rank they were to battle, and flee or chase the other if you knew his rank would win or lose from you. So after about an hour of playing this game, at night, in near darkness, I was chased by another guy, but managed to lose him. Then I proceeded to walk into a random direction till I reached the edge of the forest. At the edge were a couple of trees where 3 people were crouching down, staring into one direction. As I wasn't wearing glasses, and I have -3, I couldn't see that they weren't children, but men from around 25 to 30 years old. When I crouched next to them and asked one of them what rank he was, he angrily hissed at me to go away and leave quickly. I don't know what the hell these guys were doing there, but I ran away as fast as I could. I grew up with a very outdoorsy family. We always went camping and hiking in the summer. I grew up outside. My mother told this story to my sister and I about a time she went camping with my dad before we were born. I was in my tent, and it was the middle of the night, perhaps 1 a.m., and I had woken up to go pee, just like normal. I was about to unzip the tent, when I heard a small scratching sound. I paused. It was a slow, deliberate crunchy, digging, kind of sound. It was too rhythmic for an animal, so after making sure it wasn't your father, who was sharing the tent, I unzipped a corner of the door and peeked out. The moon was just bright enough for me to see a young woman squatting right next to our little 2-man tent, digging at the ground with her bare hands. Even your father was scared. So he went and shined a flashlight on her and told her to go back to wherever she had made camp. The woman got up silently, leaving a 4-inch deep hole next to the tent, and started walking away. I went outside, went pee, and got back into my sleeping bag. A few minutes later, I was awoken again by a clattering sound, of a person or animal walking around where we had put our stuff. I looked outside again, and the woman was crouched low, walking around our stuff and looking at things the way a monkey might. Your father stepped out of the tent, shined the flashlight on her again, and she faced him. He asked her to kindly leave their stuff alone, but she just stood there, dirty and neglected looking, but clearly not malnourished, staring at his light. He gave up and went back into our tent. Soon, we heard her digging again at her little hole, which was literally 6 inches and 2 pieces of thin nylon away from my head. I shouted for her to go away, and she ran away in an animalistic kind of way, and never returned. I fell back asleep, and in the morning, our stuff was scattered, but nothing was stolen. The end. Not creepy, just unusual and weird. I was hiking with my dad in the mountainous area between Germany and Czech Republic one day a couple years ago, and we were on the highest point of our trek, on a small trail with an overhang nearby on the left side, but both sides of the trail were surrounded by small shrubbery. We were walking in silence, and I look up, and farther down the trail is an animal that quickly dashed to the side as I looked up. This sounds weird, but the animal was white, with a huge, long tail and the body of a large fox. It looked exactly like the Pokemon Ninetales, just white as snow. Camping in Australia, the middle of nowhere up past Wiluna in Western Australia. It's just you, your fellow campmates, and kilometers of empty bush land, and sheep and kangaroos and flies, oh god, the flies. We camped at the base of a small range of hills. Spent the evening climbing up, down and all over them with our friends' kids. Lots exploring to do. Mate tells me he feels like we're being watched. My response was, yeah right, who would be this far out? During the night we hear scratching on the tent and knocking on the caravan walls. Then the sound of something jiggling the handle to each door on the caravan and thumping around the cars as well now. By now the entire camp is awake and freaking out, but no one was brave enough to get out of their tents or the caravan. We could also hear loud footsteps and huffing and puffing. Get up the next morning and there is a huge ducking bull in the middle of our camp using pretty much anything it can to scratch itself on. Few trees equal no real areas to scratch himself, obviously. So we chased the bull off and then discover the huge ducking footprints, human-shaped, going around our camp. I've got size 9 ladies and these things were massive. Everyone sort of looked at each other, packed up as fast as we can and hoped the hell out of there. Had been out stargazing and was sleeping out in a park near town, no tent, just a sleeping bag and pad. This was a fairly popular area for joggers, walkers, etc. I had found a nice spot in a field few hundred meters from the top, obscured by tall grass and brush but with a nice view of the valley below and mountains in the distance. It was very nice. Saw some shooting stars, heard coyotes singing in the distance, and slept very well since it was a warm summer night. In the morning, at the crack of dawn, I was woken up by one of the strangest performances I've ever witnessed. Above me on the hill I could hear some kind of chanting. Due to my concealed location, I couldn't actually see what was going on, and I wasn't keen on moving to a better vantage point lest I be seen by the group. A man's loud and deep voice was half chanting, half shouting in a language I couldn't identify. It sounded like a Latin-derived language, and was definitely not Spanish, although he kept repeating a word which sounded similar to Diablo, Spanish for the devil. There were other voices too, but he was clearly leading whatever was happening up there. Eventually he finished his chant/shout, there were some cheers and whoops, and then the entire group silently departed. After waiting a while to make sure it was clear, I went up to where the sound had come from. There was no physical evidence of whatever had happened. I asked everybody I knew in town if they had any idea what it might have possibly been, and nobody had heard anything like it. To this day, one of my greatest regrets is not peeking out of my hiding spot to see what the heck was going on. I was geocaching once, and as I was just wandering through the woods I came across a small patch of trees that had Mr. Potato Head faces nailed to them. I was 15 kims from civilization, and nowhere near a trail, as the cache was deep in the woods. I contacted the cache owner and he swore they weren't there when he put the cache together, and it was his private land so nobody should have put it there. The other instance of weird was when I was hitchhiking and decided to set up camp off in the woods not far from the highway, had a fire, ate and set up my little tent. Fell asleep without a problem. Woke up in the middle of the night to some heavy breathing outside my tent. I listened for a bit scared shitless and then some movement and the sound was gone. Woke up the next morning and there was photo of a family stuck with a nail to a tree right beside my tent, and fresh footprints in the dirt. Being the idiot that I am, I followed the path of the footprints a km or so back into the woods, where it ended at a road. Across the street was an abandoned house, and while checking out the house for anything useful I found several other photos of the people from the photo, individual headshots, and notes apologizing for not protecting them, or not being there for them. I got a feeling like I wasn't alone and decided to make an exit, and as I came out of the house there was a pickup truck in the road watching me leave. He offered me a ride back to the highway, and some food/drink, and told me all about the family that lived there and how they all died. I never visited the area again. It was near the border of Montana/Alberta, and I have since moved far, far away. This is not my story, it's my brother's. But it's one of the most bizarre things I've ever heard, and since I haven't seen him post in here, I'm adding it. My brother, Jay, was a part of the orienteering team in high school. For those who don't know, orienteering is when they put you in the middle of nowhere in teams of 2, give you a map and a compass, and you must find your way to each check-in station, in order. And it's a race. So my brother and his partner set out, make it through the first few checkpoints, and are feeling pretty solid. But they don't make it to the next one when they think they're supposed to. They double check the map, do some math, and figure out that they miscalculated some angle or another and are now almost off the edge of the map. They recalculate, and set off in a new direction. Keep in mind, this line was never intended to be part of the orienteering run. This is unexplored territory. And they come across what my brother said could only be described as a crater. A deep bowl in the forest, devoid of trees. At the center of it was an ambulance. They are in the woods, miles upon miles from any roads, and there is an ambulance that looks like it's decades old sitting in a crater. So being teenage boys, they go to investigate it, duck the race. My brother said that the forest was well on its way to reclaiming the vehicle, that it was rusted and covered in plant life. It looked out of date, like it came from the 40s or some bygone era. In the back, the gurney was still there, but bent in the middle, like something had smashed it. There were brown smears on the walls, that could have been rust, or dirt, or shit, or old blood. They both got a horrible feeling from the place and took off out of there. My brother thinks he could probably find it again, but flat out refuses to. Was out hunting deep in the woods in New Brunswick. My uncle has a hunting cabin in West New Brunswick with no neighbors for miles, at least a 25-minute drive in each direction on the only road that runs through. So we settled in the cabin, and went to sleep. The next morning we woke up early and began our 9-hour hike through the woods to where we set up camp. It's my uncle's private property in the middle of nowhere, and it is the most beautiful place I've ever been to. So we get to the site and set up our alarms for the bears and get our fire going, set up the tents, yada da. We cook our food and shoot the shit for the afternoon drinking and whatnot, then go to bed. We wake up early again to go hunting, and I heard my buddy shriek. So I look out my tent and see a big ducking dildo in a dead deer's anus. I swear to duck we thought, okay, joke's over who did this, but we all swore we didn't know how it got there. The deer had no gunshot wound anywhere on its body or any signs of physical damage. To this day we don't know how the dildo deer got to our campsite, being hours from any civilization. You know how there is a statistic that goes something like a cougar is watching you in the wilderness a majority of the time? While snow camping, me and some buddies were gathering firewood and crossing a frozen lake. We were following some rabbit tracks when we notice another pair of tracks meeting up with it. Suddenly the rabbit tracks end and there is a bit of blood and snow. The second tracks continue into the trees. Later that night I went to take a pee and there were easily 30 eyes staring me down on the edge of the lake. I looked around and there were easily 100 more eyes staring at me. It was a pack of coyotes checking out our camp. Another time snow camping, me and another guy were sleeping in a snow cave. We heard some footsteps on the roof above us. They eventually go away. A little later we hear what we think is screeching and howling out of the hole in our snow cave. It was just woo-yet enough to think we were freaking ourselves out. I shined a light out of our cave and I caught a cougar 12 feet outside our snow cave hole stalking around. It ran up a tree it was right next to, but we didn't sleep much after that. Animals are cool but also rather scary to come in contact with when camping. I have more stories, but these were probably my most memorable. My friends and I make a habit of exploring closed logging roads when we are out in the woods. A couple years ago, as we found a road that had been trenched out, but had a couple of cars parked at the end of it. This isn't particularly unusual, and we figured that if people were parked there, at the very least we would find some huckleberry. As we were hiking along, we passed a family of people that appeared to be doing what we were, and just looking around and harvesting some food. As we got near the end of a road, we found some huge piles of freshly dug earth. Attempts had been made to smooth it against the hill face to make it less obvious, but it was still very apparent. Needless to say, we began exploring the area. Just up the hill, we found a couple of trees that had caves dug under them, so that the roots formed a sort of semi-domed ceiling. These were completely empty. As we continued exploring, we started to hear voices, couldn't see anyone, but they were out there. This is when we decided to return to the road, because we probably weren't welcome in that area. Just around the next corner, we reached the end of the road. This is where it started to get really creepy. On the ground, nestled in some rocks, was a still hot cup of coffee. No stove, no people, no tents, nothing, just a cup of coffee. Nailed to a tree next to the coffee was a hand-painted plywood sign. It was a simple warning that cave-ins had been occurring, and to evacuate children from the shelters if you saw any dirt falling from the ceiling. At this point, we knew we really weren't welcome, so we got out of Dodge as fast as we could. But we never passed the family. They were gone. All of the cars were still parked at the end of the road, but the people we had passed had vanished. I still have no idea where they went. I was, inadvertently, once the creepiest thing in the woods. I've been a pagan since 1993. It's a serious religion involving the worship of gods and goddesses of pre-Christian Europe and in revering nature. So there was a secluded spot in the woods where my group and I used to hold our rituals. It wasn't deep in the woods. It was right off of a major road. But it was quiet enough so that we could practice our religion outdoors, in private. We'd light a bonfire and worship. No weird sacrifices. Nothing nefarious. Despite the fact that we had a fire and wore hooded robes or other dark clothing, it's more new agey than sinister. Also, I had a weird sense of humor. So one night before ritual, one of the guys from my group was running late. I was waiting around for him in my robe. I saw headlights and, assuming it was my friend, tried to look spooky. As you can probably tell, it wasn't my friend from the group. They pulled out as fast as they could and I heard screams from inside the car. So someone, somewhere has a scary story to tell about driving into the woods and coming across a weird bonfire ritual full of dark-robed figures worshipping with a scary-looking bald guy guarding the entrance. The weirdest one was when I was hiking with my brother and we stumbled upon a grow-op on a hillside in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't too far from a small community, but it was a few miles up a steep creek bed. We had taken a rugged logging road to get there, and then hiked along a very rough trail we found. There were probably 50 very healthy marijuana plants. It was on Crown, public, land, so we were allowed to hike there, but we sure didn't hang around to find out whose crop it was. Another time we were hiking on the top of a mountain, looking for interesting rocks. The mountain was known to the local natives as an old spiritual site, and there was definitely that sense of otherworldliness in the air. Evening was coming, so we were heading back to my car. We found a cairn made of rocks balanced together. As we approached it, we saw something bright orange in the space formed between the leaning rocks, right in the exact center of the configuration. It looked like something man-made and was jarringly out of place in this very isolated setting. When we got near it, we realized that the bright orange was the last tiny drop of sunlight, literally, everywhere else was already in shadow, that had somehow fallen right in the middle of the cairn at the exact moment for us to find it. It was bright orange because it was late summer and there were a lot of wildfires in the area. Of course, it was just an amazing coincidence, but it sure was creepy and ethereal. That reminds me of another one. We were driving down a remote mountain road after a day of fishing. It was dark, and suddenly we came upon a mysterious cloud of smoke enveloping the road. We couldn't see any source for it, and we were at least 15 miles away from any houses. We stopped the car, and when we walked back up the road a bit, we could see, about 50 feet from the road in a little gully, a wildfire burning. It was about 10 feet by 10 feet and warm enough that we could feel it from the road. The creepy part was that when we drove up that road earlier in the day to get to the lake, we had noticed a faint smoky smell. It must have been sparked by lightning earlier and was just slowly growing. That was a remote road, and had we not found it, I am sure it would have gotten much larger before it was noticed. I used to live in Wells, Nevada, a tiny town. Really, the only things to do around there was camp, backpack, and hunt. Most of the time, it was a great time. However, one trip in particular stands out to me. I was not but a wee lad, at the tender age of 14, when my father decided to take a trip out to Jarbidge. It's an absolutely beautiful area, and the trip out is stunning, with lots of old abandoned buildings to check out and explore. Tons of cool stuff to do. Anywho, we drove out, and decided to explore this building that had obviously been abandoned long ago. I had a 12 gauge with me, as well as my .44 strapped to my hip, just because I'm from a gun-savvy family, I suppose. This is important for the next part. We walked up to the door to the place, but I heard something incredibly odd. It sounded like someone was sawing on something, like a piece of wood. I tugged on my dad, and told him, but he just shrugged it off. Just after I told him, a voice came from inside telling us to come in. It was obviously from an older gentleman, but nevertheless made us jump. My father is extremely outgoing, however, and decides to go in despite my repeated attempts at doing the exact opposite. So, we went in, and the first thing the man says, "You ain't gonna shoot me with that, now are you, son?" I quickly shook my head no, and gave a gentle laugh. I thought he was joking. My father introduces himself and I, as well as my younger brother. The man introduces himself as Wayne Prunty. He immediately tells us he is 127 years old, he couldn't have been older than 80, and that he'd been raised around here. What follows is, as far as I can remember, directly how the conversation went. It is as all over as it appears. Well, I was born into a home with just my ma and siblings, because father had gone out and froze himself to death in the harsh winters we got around here. It wasn't long after I was born that I followed in his footsteps and tried crawling out there into the snow. I about froze to death, but ma saved me by finding me out there in the snow and dragging me back inside, but she froze to death herself doing it. "Did you bring me any potatoes?" I tell ya, I was in Ireland during their famine, and I could really use some potatoes. In fact, my cousin served in World War II, but was killed and reincarnated as my brother. Anyway, I used to work down in Las Vegas. I built over 1,000 hotels and homes. I built this place here too, actually. I also built the Notre Dame, as I'm a very religious man, but goddammit, someone stole the doors right off the place. At this point he looked at me and asked again, "Are you gonna shoot me, boy?" I said no, and put my gun near the door to put him at ease. At this point, I can see behind him, and see that there's a table set with perfect china and proper silverware for 4. The exact number of us there. I returned to my seat, and had an incredibly uneasy feeling. I've never felt that way before, and never since, but it was disturbing. I started telling my dad that we had to go, but before I could finish, we heard the sound of tires coming down the road. The old man leapt to his feet and was immediately disturbed. "What? Who's that? Why is someone here? No one was supposed to come." He began walking towards the door, which is where I'd set my shotgun down. My dad also jumped up, and we quickly left. I've never felt so disturbed in my life. We let the other folks who'd pulled up know that it probably wasn't wise to go in, and we jumped in the truck and left. When we got home, of course I told everyone I could about it. A buddy did a bit of research and found out that the Prunties were a local family with a long history of mental illness. Wayne Prunty was real, however, he had an obituary from 5 years prior to us meeting him. Now, I don't know if that was the same individual, but I do know that when we went a year later, there was no traces of anyone ever being there. Still spooks me to this day. We were hiking at night to a popular spot back in the woods where an old Victorian-style house and farm that had been abandoned for many years to hang out and smoke pot. The house appeared stereotypically haunted, and all of the surrounding trees and adjacent buildings added to the spooky vibe. As we approached the front of the house, we see that the front porch had collapsed, blocking the front door. As we move alongside of the house, we passed by a toppled building that only the roof was intact, lying on its side, which made a slanted shelter that you could see through to the other side. As we approached it, we heard muffled voices coming from deep inside of it. We all stopped and listened. The voices we heard were unmistakably real. We could hear the talking voices, but couldn't make out what they were saying. We were all very creeped out and called out to anyone who might be in there, to no response. We shined our lights into it and saw nothing but brush and leaves. One of us gets the guts to enter the toppled shed, and approach the direction the voices were coming from. He goes in alone, and when he gets to the end of the shelter, we hear rustling in the leaves beneath it, and hear our friend yell, "What the duck? Guys, come here." We follow him to where he was standing, and we are all standing right above where the voices were coming from, with the talking coming from directly beneath us. We start to dig at the leaves toward the sound, and we unearthed an old crank-style survival radio, tuned to NPR. It had been covered in about a foot of dirt and leaves, and was covered in wet grime. We couldn't figure out what/when/how it had got there, or how it was still working. It wasn't a hospitable place, and there was no sign of a camp or chill-out area set up, so we decided it must have been put there by another hiker trying to freak other people out, and it had worked much longer than they anticipated. It freaked us out trying to figure it out, so we left and decided to get stoned elsewhere. To this day we talk about that radio we found buried in that old broken down shed way out in the woods, and my friend still has it sitting in his garage. I'm from Australia. When I was in year 11, my outdoor education class went on a camping trip to some campground about an hour's drive away from civilization. Seeing as it was a school trip, rules were imposed such as no leaving tents after 11 p.m., and others. A group of my friends and I decided we would sneak out and go exploring around the campsite to see if we could find anything interesting, and we did. We found some old, abandoned train cars. Inside the train cars there was glass scattered on the ground from smashed windows, lots of mirrors. With only our torches as a light source, it was pretty creepy. We were looking around for about 10 minutes when we hear movement coming from the other train car, and are immediately freaked out. I shine my torch through the glass in the doors separating our two cars, and we can make out a silhouette of a person looking back at us. We ran back to the campsite as fast as we could. Also, on the same camping trip, we decided to sneak out again on a different night and go exploring in the completely opposite direction of the abandoned train cars. We were walking up a path, when we saw what looked like to be the shape of a man further up the path, just standing to the side, either facing us or turned away from us. We came to the conclusion it was probably either someone from our class, our teacher, or someone from the campsite. We continued walking on the path and got pretty close to this man now. At this point we could see that he was facing us, and we could make out his facial features. He wasn't anyone we knew, so we turned around and started walking back. We could hear him laughing and heard footsteps trailing us, so we started running. We couldn't hear steps after a while, so we started walking again. I reached into my pocket to check the time on my phone and couldn't feel anything. Realizing I'd dropped my phone, I told my friends and we reluctantly turned back. Further up the path we could see a little light on the ground and pretty much knew it was my phone, so we went and picked it up. After unlocking it to see if there were any cracks or anything on it from the drop, I was major freaked out to find that it was on a draft message with just hello on the screen. I hate camping. My brother and me were hiking, we lost track of time and it's got dark. We managed to get near a point where our father could pick us up. While we were waiting, we separated a bit and I heard a rock breaking. I assumed it was my brother, but he asked me, "What are you doing, bro?" In that moment we realized that someone or something was around. We ran to a rocky wall, climbing it like a pair of monkeys being hunted by a beast. We didn't see anything and we didn't hear nothing more, but we stood still in the top of the rocks until our father comes. When he arrives in the car, we asked him to point the lights to the woods. We saw a fresh, green branch, as an arm width, broken. There are no animals in our country that can broke a branch like that. Besides, we heard nothing but the branch breaking. There was no wind and the branch were green and healthy. We still have no explanation for that. We have told the story to many people and no one have one either. Once went camping in Algonquin Park. There was a thunderbox a little bit away from the campsite. I had to use the washroom, it was dark out and I had no flashlight. I walked through the bush to get to it, did my business, and started to walk back. I heard some noises to the left of me, so I was getting a little creeped out. Suddenly, a pack of coyotes crossed right in front of me, looked at me, and carried on. It less than 10 feet in front of me, so it gave me a good little scare. I also live right behind a small forest and art gallery. One night I decided to shortcut home and walk through the long driveway of the art gallery through the beginning of the forest. Every 50 feet or so is a light post, but it still stays dark. I didn't realize there was a new art installation tucked just off the driveway. It's about the scariest art display ever. Looks like something right out of Blair Witch. There are about 6 of these, creepy, wooden structures, in the forest. I was camping in the Northern Territory in house with 3 other girls. This old guy was alone camping near us, came over and sat down whilst we were eating our dinner and starts talking about himself loads and invited us for a pitch black midnight dip with him in the nearby creek, which by the way is riddled with crocs and duck knows what else. Obviously we said no. We had a fire going, so my friend got her camera to take photos of it and he asked if we wanted him to take a photo of the 4 of us by the fire, so we said yeah, okay. So he takes the photo, then says my friend's camera doesn't have the motion setting as one does. So he goes off to his tent to get his own camera and then came over taking loads of photos of us. We weren't posing at all. Just standing by the fire feeling awkward as duck, but we didn't want to tell this guy to duck off and get him angry since we're camping next to him overnight. Anyway, we say we're gonna go to bed now. And so we do. I barely slept and in the middle of the night I heard footsteps coming up to our camp. I didn't want to scare the other girls, so I just waited and heard the footsteps move away again. In the morning, one of the other girls asked if anyone else heard footsteps in the night and all 4 of us had. He was passed out asleep outside of his tent in the morning. We quickly got the duck out of there. There was this small cemetery that was located on the outskirts of the small town I lived in during my high school years. There was easy access to the beach from the road that looped around the cemetery. The path from the road and through the woods to the beach was not very long and it was such a beautiful spot. I enjoyed my solitude and would bike there often enough that I was never spooked or anything. One gorgeous summer day, I had taken my usual trip to the beach and walked for about a half an hour down the shore. On my return, I stopped to rest on a large log while looking at some sand shells I collected and just took in the ocean. After a few minutes I started to hear some activity/rustling about in the woods. Thinking it was other folks coming down to the beach, I stepped into the edge of the woods to observe and didn't see anyone or anything. I brushed it off as most likely a small animal running about. I decided to head back after the noises seemed a bit louder and closer. As I entered the path back to the road and my bike, I kept hearing the rustle but again didn't see anything. I picked up pace, suddenly trying hard not to get spooked, the hair on my neck raised. I arrived at my bike, hopped on and hightailed it out of there, as fast as my little legs could pedal. Along the side of the woods of the road, I could hear the rustling keeping up with me and it sounded like it was getting louder and closer. I was at the point of sheer panic by the time I reached the edge of town. Vehicles passing and folks out walking were heavenly relief. The sound ceased and I felt home free. I never went back down there on my own again. When I was about 8 years old living in southern Mississippi, I crawled underneath a chain-link fence that was fencing off about 10 acres of woods that was bordering my apartment complex. I found a trail which led to what I believe was a hobo shack. It looked like a fort built out of scrap wood. There was porno magazines scattered all over this little campsite along with a hammer and nails. My friend and I nailed some pictures to a tree and then continued down the path. What we found was really creepy. There was a large circular clearing in the trees where trees had been cut down and the logs stacked off to the side. There were about 20 to 30 folding chairs all arranged in a circle with absolutely nothing next to them except for a single hatchet. No people, no way into this place except for a hole in a fence, and nothing but a hobo shack and a mysterious clearing in the woods. Anyway, my friend and I grabbed the hatchet and got the duck out of there as fast as we could. I was a cop in rural Oregon, lots of forest land. One day in August we got a call. Some people said they found a body in the woods, so I met with them to find out where it was. He described the location, said it looked like the guy was cutting wood cause there was a chainsaw nearby and axes in his truck, which was parked on the skidder road near the body. He says, and I should tell you, the head is missing. So the creepy factor goes way up and I called for some extra people to come to the scene. I should also explain that the road this was on was really just a dirt track with washouts every 6 feet or so, barely passable even in the summer with a hardcore 4WD vehicle. So we get there and find the dead guy, and yes, no head is visible but it still looks like he is moving a bit. It turns out with the heat of summer he is completely covered with maggots swarming over him, and it was the movement of the worms that made it look like he was moving. What had happened to make him dead was he made living selling firewood and had tried to fall a dead snag and it snapped, hit his head hard and fast enough to snap his neck, kind of an internal decapitation, which whipped around under his body, barely connected to it still by some skin. We found it under his body. Once we got the maggots off we saw that they had completely eaten away the flesh on his face and his chest clear down to the ribcage. The missing head was the initial creepy but the swarming of the maggots giving the illusion of movement was actually much worse. Some poor sad sack had to stay and watch the scene until we could come back the next morning with the right equipment and get the body out. Not a camper, but stayed in a shack on Torres Strait Island in South Australia. This is an island that is placed at the Murray River mouth, so it's a really pretty place where the river meets the sea. Was partying with about a dozen other friends and we were having an excellent night. We were on the side of the island that faces the river, which is less populated than the other side and has a bit more scrub land. We ended up all settling down around 2 a.m. Woke up to the sound of beating djemunji drums at like 2:45 a.m. Got up, tried to rouse some of my friends to no avail, was met with sleepy curses. So I'm walking around the inside of the shack, my comrades sleeping around me, thinking I'm going absolutely nuts because no one else is reacting to this completely surreal situation. Guys, these drums were loud as shit. When I say djemunji, I really mean that. This wasn't a drum kit. This was a full freaking tribe of bongos being played out in the dark. I crept up to a couple of windows to try to look out in different directions, to see if I could see anyone awake or the source of the rhythmic noise, to no avail. Ended up tucking myself back into bed confused, adrenaline pumping. Next thing, about 5 minutes after waiting in bed, the drums stopped. I stayed awake for about an hour, at a guess, after they stopped, but then eventually drifted off as the adrenaline wore off. Woke up a few hours later and was asking everyone about it, and was met with weird looks. One of my friends says she remembered hearing them, but only vaguely. I just dropped the whole thing after that, but was on edge the next couple of nights before we left. Was the most surreal experience. I often wonder if I just dreamt it, but I know I got up to check things out. Edit, prematurely pressed send, had to go back and finish the story. On a hiking trip with a couple friends I walked away from camp to poop. As I dodged trees to get further from camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. I kept looking around expecting to spot a wide-eyed deer or something, but never saw anything alive. It's just one of those creepy feelings you get sometimes, but I marched onward and found a likely pooping spot. Dropped true and looked around, and spotted a beer bottle balanced on a downed tree. Beer bottle, no big deal, right? Lots of people camp in the woods and drink beer. Probably the last group left a bottle behind. Except I noticed a bead of condensation trickling down the side. That meant the beer was still cold. I pulled up my pants and investigated the beer. It was 3/4 full and felt like it was fresh from an ice cooler. Looked around again and still couldn't see anyone else around. I ran back to camp. I was with some friends hiking through the hills around a little town in central Utah. We came upon these weird openings in the bottom of the cliffs that just naturally looked like open eyes just by the shape of the top of the opening and the way the rubble covered the bottom. There was even 2 of them side by side. After all the hills have eyes jokes, we shined a flashlight in one of them and saw it actually went in pretty far. The light just faded into the darkness. We decided to send one guy in who was pretty athletic to check it out. He was petty thin, So he slid in, and once he got in he started shouting back to us about how huge it was inside. It almost immediately opened up into a huge tunnel. We all slid in after him. I'm a little heavier, so it was difficult, but I got in too. I remember it being a pretty tight fit getting through the most open part of the eye, but as soon as I was through, I could sit up. A few feet later, I could stand up. We walked through the tunnel and pretty quick we figured out it was an old mining shaft by all the support beams and such. We explored a lot of the tunnels, climbed over a lot of rubble, looked at some graffiti, checked out some weird little rooms. It was pretty cool, so we all climb out and we head into the other one. This one was actually more difficult for me to get into. This was obviously another mining shaft, but there was no graffiti in this one. Nothing. We walk along until we hit the end of this corridor. At the end of the corridor was a stack of rocks. It was about waist high. It wasn't leaning against the walls. It was out in the center and standing on its own. On top of this stack of rocks was a doll. A ratty little doll of a girl, staring at us down the corridor. Haunted cabin stories in mid-Michigan. About 24 years ago my parents bought 20 acres of riverfront property near Everett, Me. There's a small single-story house on the land that was used as a hunting cabin. We would take up residence there for vacation. House is pretty old, has an artisan well that's creepy as duck, but here we go. Everyone in my family of 5 except me and my brother have had experiences. My dad woke up with someone sitting on his chest. My sister said she saw a hunter at the foot of her bed. My mom said something was licking her hand when all the dogs were asleep in the other room. My dad and mom told me that after we went to bed one night they were out at the bonfire and a small circle of light appeared on the ground that turned into a shaft and went up into a cloudless sky. Granted they were drunk and only they witnessed it, but I've heard them tell the story a dozen times and they seem they were pretty convinced it happened. One day, my mom, sister, and grandmother saw a patch of flowers by the well, which was a pipe sticking out over a boarded up hole, the ground with dirt at the shallow bottom. Looking at these flowers in a certain way, they spelled out help. I never saw them, and my dad mowed them over there next day because nobody told him. They awoke one day to find a pot sitting over the well access in the kitchen. No way this pot got there without someone putting it there, and nobody fesses up to doing it. Last time I was up there this past year, we were putting up drywall when the TV downstairs turned itself on. This was the first and only time it did it. Aside from that, I love it up there. The 20 acres has so much forest diversity, it's amazing. We have sections of planted pine, then a whole older maple grove with large rocks, a decline with large swamps, a own field with ferns, then finally the river front with a stream leading to it with small waterfalls.